Hello everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar on insulin resistance understood. We'll just wait just a few seconds just for letting people into the webinar, and then we will get started. Just some housekeeping whilst we're waiting. We are recording this webinar, however, any faces will be blurred. So if you want to put your camera on, it is lovely to see you. We will be taking questions at the end as well. So please do use the chat box function. So any questions that you have, just put in the chat box and we'll get to it at the end of the presentation. Anything else, again, just use the chat box there, and we will get started. So, like I said, welcome everyone to this evening's webinar on insulin resistance understood. So today we're going to look at the link between insulin resistance and overall metabolic health and what insulin resistance actually means. So it's a very commonly used phrase, but understanding what it actually means can be a little bit complex. So hopefully we'll break that down and make it easier to understand. We'll look at the cause of insulin resistance, and then how to manage and reduce insulin resistance by looking at our metabolic health. And I'll speak a bit about our programs that we run as well at the end before we get into the Q&A. So what is the relevance of insulin? So you might find it quite an interesting webinar title that we picked. And this is why we have picked it, because up to 46% of adults worldwide have metabolic syndrome. And actually, most recent data is showing about 88% of people have metabolic dysfunction. So that technically means only about 12% of our population is currently metabolically healthy. So it's becoming extremely, extremely common, and it's definitely something that we need to address. So it's a big, big issue. So you might be saying, what is metabolic syndrome? So it's a cluster of conditions together. So waist circumference being elevated, your blood pressure being elevated, your glucose being higher than what it should be, your triglycerides being higher, which is just your type of cholesterol marker, and your HDL being low, again, type of cholesterol marker, is deemed as the good cholesterol. So it's just one we want to have a little bit more of because it helps break down the cholesterol, which can actually damage our arteries. So what is the relevance? So insulin resistance actually is the root cause of a lot of our lifestyle common conditions and diseases that we see. So even though they can all have sort of their own stimuli to increase likelihoods, so such as genetics, for example, or environment, they all have that one common problem of insulin resistance. So it makes sense to target that root cause instead of treating them individually like we currently are doing within our healthcare system. So when I say common, conditions, I'm talking about the ones on the screen. So diabetes, heart disease, cancer, fatty liver, PCOS, erectile dysfunction, dementia, migraines, and excess body fat. It's all relating back to insulin resistance in the body. So this is a case study which I wanted to share with you all because I think it is quite powerful. So this is someone who went to the GP because they were struggling with back pain and felt like they needed a knee op and just didn't feel well in themselves. So this person was 52 years old. They had acid reflux, high blood pressure, pre-diabetes, depression, IBS, osteoporosis, back pain, and they wanted to lose weight to obviously reduce that back and knee pain, and they were also tired all the time. So at this point, they were on 5 different types of medication. So again, treating those sort of individual conditions and diseases instead of that root cause. And once we discuss sort of the relevance of insulin resistance and how to combat that, I'm going to share with you the results for this individual once they targeted insulin resistance. So you'll have to stay tuned to find out what happened. So what is insulin resistance? So one way in understanding it is looking at the structure of our cells. So every cell in the human body has an insulin receptor. So it's actually quite a key hormone, one of the most key, to be honest, in the body. So it has a big impact. And essentially, insulin will flow through the blood and knock on the door of the cell that's specifically designed for insulin. So, for example, it could be a muscle cell or your brain cell. And then that cell will respond with the specific action. So insulin's most famous action is taking that glucose. So we're only supposed to have about a teaspoon of blood glucose at once. So it's not designed to have lots of glucose in our bloodstream. So insulin will come along and it will knock on the door of the cell and say, please, can you take this glucose out of the bloodstream? There's too much. And the cell will take it in and convert it into energy, essentially, to use. However, if this keeps on happening, and the blood glucose keeps on rising, the cells are maxed out essentially with glucose, our body will start producing more and more insulin to get exactly the same action. So it's working really hard just to do the bare minimum, essentially. So blood glucose levels rise, insulin's knocking on the door, but the cell just isn't answering anymore. And then that's when you get that elevated blood glucose that you see in sort of your pre-diabetes, your type 2 diabetes diagnosis. And then living in with that high insulin all the time is called hyperinsulinemia, which is also really, really important to consider, and a massive component of insulin resistance, just chronic high insulin, which we'll go on to in a second. So what causes insulin resistance? Stress. So cortisol is our stress hormone in the body, is what wakes us up in the morning. We do need it. However, it's not designed to be chronic. So that's the key difference. We're not designed to be in a chronic stress state. And sleep deprivation, interestingly, is one of the leading causes of chronic high stress. So if you do struggle with sleep, it is a very, very important thing to address. Inflammation, so that could be through things like smoking, air pollution, illness or infection, increasing that insulin resistance, so decreasing insulin sensitivity, and hyperinsulinemia. So like I said, that chronic high insulin is that key sort of indicator of insulin resistance. So our body constantly producing insulin to bring down our blood glucose. And the easiest way to think about this is any constant stimulus will eventually lead to resistance to that stimulus. So I'm sure people with children can really sort of empathize with this on the screen. So if you're surrounded by your children 24/7, you kind of have selective hearing, don't you? You can tune out of that stimulus because you constantly are exposed to it. Whereas if someone potentially didn't have children and they were looking after yours, they would probably struggle a little bit more because they're not used to that stimulus. So you do build up a tolerance, and this is the same for sort of insulin resistance. It's a constant stimulus, so it's just being ignored essentially. So you might be asking sort of, why has it become so common in our worldwide population? And this is why. So you can see here on the screen, there's a pie chart, and the vast majority of that is made up of carbohydrates. And this is representing our general diet globally. So we're eating a very high amount of carbohydrates and smaller amounts of protein and fat. And this is significant because carbohydrates produce the biggest response to insulin in the body. So every time we eat something starchy, we will get a spike in blood glucose, which is then obviously triggering our insulin to be released to lower that blood glucose. Whereas fat and protein, it's quite stable, so it doesn't really trigger an insulin response at all because it's not spiking our blood glucose. And the problem is, for an insulin sensitive person, when your blood glucose is spiked, triggering that insulin release, that insulin stays high for about 3 hours, roughly. Whereas in an insulin resistance person, it actually stays high for about 5 hours. So it's very significant. It's constantly elevated, which is why I'm saying this hyperinsulinemia is so important to address in the body. So if we're only eating 3 meals a day, it might only be spiked 3 times. But actually, really commonly now, most people don't just have 3 meals a day. It's 3 meals plus snacking in between. So even for an insulin sensitive person, your insulin's pretty high most of the day, especially if we're having high amounts of starchy carbohydrate. So it essentially never gets turned off. It's constantly on, which is really significant because essentially that's our fat storing hormone. So if that's constantly elevated, our body cannot do any breakdown of fat that we have. We can't use any stores. So it's really imperative. So this was a really interesting study that looked at, how quickly insulin resistance can actually happen in the body. And they measured participants over a space of a week, and they got them to consume more carbohydrates over the space of that week. And they found that their blood glucose stayed pretty much similar in terms of their fasting blood glucose levels. But actually, their insulin increased by 2.5, so significant increase over the space of a week. And this just goes to show how easy it is for insulin resistance to develop and how easy it is for us not to know that is happening. So it's something that's quite silent, it's happening behind the scenes, and it's only when our body gets to the point where it can't cope any longer, we see that increase in blood glucose. So some sort of early signs of insulin resistance is just to look out for and be aware of things like low energy levels. So if you're crashing quite a lot throughout the day, really struggling with that, it could be a sign. Imbalanced mood, again, with sort of blood glucose spikes and crashes, it tends to affect our mood and our cognition. So when that's unstable, often our mood is unstable too. Hunger and cravings, so particularly in a blood glucose crash, you experience sort of that hangry feeling where your body is sort of screaming at you for energy and is just asking for food, and that's when we can't think straight and probably we're not our best selves. So that's also a sign, if you're constantly hungry, you're constantly experiencing cravings, that things aren't quite right. Aches and pains, again, that's sort of indicating inflammation in the body, so insulin resistance. Lingering menopause symptoms as well. Increased blood glucose levels, like I already explained, and excess fat mass, because again, your body's storing that fat. It cannot break it down if your insulin is constantly high. So it's really important to think about, you may have perfect bloods now, but actually this can still be silently happening in the background. And it takes about 10 to 15 years to develop. So it's not a quick overnight process. It's very much gradual. And a massive component is, how much ultra processed food or carbohydrates we're eating. Inactivity, so if we're not using that energy, if we're fairly sedentary throughout the day, that's obviously going to contribute to making this more likely. Stress and poor sleep. So We at Coombe Grove say that all of this is reversible by looking at our 5 routes for metabolic health. So nutrition, movement, sleep, environment, and mindset. So it's targeting that holistic view to really sort of combat insulin resistance and get back to sort of that optimal metabolic health without drugs, without medication, and living a good quality life where we feel good. So I will run through each of the routes now and just tell you a little bit more information about sort of things that you can incorporate and take away and start to sort of think about going forward. So with nutrition, the key component here is eating mostly real foods. That if you take away one thing from this webinar, please just take away that. So we really want to try and avoid or minimize ultra-processed foods. So when I say ultra-processed, anything with lots of ingredients, we don't recognize what they are, anything with loads of like marketing claims all over it is a very key indicator that is ultra processed. So it's been chemically modified to change the structure of that food. It's an unnatural substance essentially. So they're often quite high in sugars and often have quite pro-inflammatory oils, so things like sort of rapeseed oil, vegetable oil. They're quite cheap, so manufacturers quite like using them, but they're not the most ideal for our health. And they're often quite low in protein, things like fiber and natural fats. And they can really disrupt our craving and appetite signals. So there was a really interesting study with a fast food chain, I won't name which one, and they studied people before and after they ate that fast food. And after their fullness hormone wasn't even present, even though they consumed nearly about 1,000 calories in that meal. So it is really significant when we eat real whole foods. Our body knows what it is, it can process it. It can really sort of get all those nutrients that it needs, and our fullness and hunger signals work efficiently. So you'll be able to see on the left-hand side, we've got a little bit of visual for you in terms of the key sort of takeaways of what your plate should look like or what you can aim for in your total overall intake. So you can see the starchy carbohydrate section is quite a bit smaller, so aiming for about 15% of your plate instead of maybe about a third. Another thing you can consider is using things like carbohydrate swaps. So those are essentially things that mimic a carbohydrate, but they're lower overall. So for example, it could be using celeriac to make things like mash or roast potatoes or butter bean mash, for example, something that's really quick and easy to incorporate. And then you want your proteins to be about 25% of your plate. So usually it's recommended to be about 15%. So we're just saying have that little bit more just to make us full and satisfied, to try and avoid snacking throughout the day. And then healthy fats is in the middle because often is part of your protein source, or it could be a dressing, for example, or using avocado and nuts and seeds. So having maybe about 2 portions of natural fats in your meal makes it extra satisfying. And if we don't enjoy our food, if we just have a really boring salad with no dressing on it, we do end up snacking later on in the day because we've just not enjoyed it. So it's not worth losing that satisfaction. It definitely include your dressings and make it tasty. And then 60% of your plate is your non-starchy vegetables. So just thinking about using a variety of colours, using vegetables that maybe you've not used for a while, and just filling your plate up with those. So when we think about carbohydrates, there is a few types. So you've got your simple carbohydrates, so things like in your cakes, your biscuits, your chocolate, And then we've got your more complex carbohydrates, so things like bread, pasta, rice, and oats. So even though they are more complex and they're in a long chain of glucose, it's still broken down in the body into those individual glucose molecules, which is released into your bloodstream. So it's a more gradual release, but it's still a significant amount of carbohydrate. So it is good to look at the total carbohydrate instead of just looking at the sugar. So consider both when making food choices. And it's a very, very effective way if you are someone that struggles with controlling your blood glucose. It's a very, very effective way of reducing your HbA1c, which is essentially your average of blood glucose over the last 3 months. So this particular study looked at 71 people with prediabetes, and they asked them to follow a low carbohydrate diet. And this was over a period for about 12 months, I think. So it was quite significant. And their HbA1c dropped from 44 to 39, and 39% achieved a normal HbA1c. So anything from sort of 44 upwards, you'd be considered sort of pre-diabetic, and then from 48 or so upwards, you'd be considered type 2, living with type 2 diabetes. So very, very effective method here, just slowly starting to reduce your starchy carbohydrates, really, really lowers that blood glucose levels, which obviously then lowers our insulin as well. So if we're trying to target hyperinsulinemia, where our insulin's chronically high, reducing carbohydrates is a really, really effective way to do that. And you can personalize this, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And our food naturally contains some carbohydrates. We can't cut it really completely. So things like even vegetables contain a small amount of carbohydrates. And then your root vegetables, things like your carrots and parsnips, contain a little bit more. Even nuts have a bit of carbohydrate. Yogurt has a bit of carbohydrates. We eat food. We don't just eat carbohydrates, protein, and fats. So you can find what the right level is for you. So a low carbohydrate essentially ranges from about 50 grams of total carbohydrate a day to 130 grams. So that's sort of the level. And if you're looking at 50 grams, that is probably quite strict, to be honest with you. It's looking at sort of that final level in your vegetables. So maybe reducing things like root vegetables, maybe reducing fruit. If you're looking at 100 grams, then you can include root vegetables, you can include some fruits, and perhaps some beans and pulses, but still having that small amount of starchy carbohydrates. So you can experiment with this, maybe start at 100 grams, see how you get on. It might be you need a little bit less, or you can do a little bit more. And it depends on your health goals as well. So just to summarize then, be mindful of how much carbohydrates that you're eating. Maybe just, pay attention to what your meals are made of going forward, and just ask yourself that question. Prioritize protein. So I can't emphasize that enough. It makes such a difference to our hunger levels. It really reduces cravings, and it's also quite tasty. So that's a win. Include lots of non-starchy vegetables, and have some natural fats to make our food satisfying. We don't want to eat food which is boring, which will lead to just snacking throughout the whole day. So another key principle is looking at time-restricted eating. So you may have heard of this phrase before, but it's essentially just elongating that natural fast that we usually have overnight. And this is important just because our bodies follow our circadian rhythm, which is essentially just our natural clock, which operates our physiology. So things like our sleeping patterns, our feeding behavior, our hormone release, our blood pressure, and our body temperature. So we want to go in line with our natural clock instead of against it. So we want to eat, ideally when it's daylight hours, not when it's too late, because that's going to impact our sleep. And also we're going to get a bigger response in blood glucose, because essentially in response to low light, your body will start to produce melatonin, that hormone that makes you feel sleepy. And then that melatonin will bind to receptors in your gut, which signals your pancreas to stop producing insulin. So if you're eating anything late at night, it's going to have a bigger impact in our body than if we eat that same food in the morning. So our bodies aren't designed for this erratic eating pattern, eating throughout the whole day. So it's just to be mindful of, do you eat from the very first thing to the very last thing in the day, or do you have that break? So essentially, we're looking at an on and off switch in the body. And many of us have a 15+ hour eating window. So we're not really giving our body that off time. So if we just think about, potentially doing a 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. eating window, which is about 10 hours, this can improve things like blood glucose control and insulin sensitivity. So if we're looking to lower that insulin, so prevent insulin resistance, or control it or reduce it, then doing this, having that off period is really key, because essentially your insulin will be really low, and it can sort of reboot itself, if you like, where it goes around, finds damaged cells and clears them out, so the process autophagy. So just to give you a little bit of a visual cue of what this could look like I said, you're having breakfast at 10 a.m. So it could be things like an omelette. You could make pre-made sort of egg cups, for example. It could be just scrambled eggs if you're having that, if you're at home and you have that flexibility. Or if you're on the go, it could be something pre-made. So even just some yogurt with maybe a bit of chia seeds in them, some berries, some nuts and seeds, and then you can always top up with some meat or fish or eggs, just some sort of protein source. If you're vegetarian or vegan, obviously looking at things like tofu, tempeh, really, really useful for increasing your protein intake. And then lunch could be a salad with one of those main protein sources that I mentioned. And then dinner could be thing like a beef stir fry, let's say. So it can be really quick and simple meals. It doesn't need to be complicated. It's just trying to plan. That's the key point here. Trying to plan sort of what you're going to have and think about it, so you don't get to that point where you come home and you just don't know what you're going to have for dinner and you're really, really hungry. And then you get all those intrusive thoughts of the quick options coming into your head. So our second route is movement. And I kind of split movement up into cardiovascular activity, so our day-to-day movement that we get in terms of our steps, how much we're moving around, and also looking at resistance training. So that is just to focus on maintaining and building muscle. And if we're looking at reducing hyperinsulinemia, so chronic high insulin, and controlling our blood glucose, or just reducing the signs of insulin resistance, movement can be so, so helpful with this. So it's essentially our second insulin in the body. So if you go for a walk after your meal, it can dramatically lower your blood glucose levels. And then essentially your body doesn't need to produce as much insulin, so it's not working that hard. So I recommend doing both if you can. So getting in sort of walking whenever you can, or some sort of cardiovascular activity. It might be that you like cycling, or swimming even, and looking at some sort of resistance training. So if you're new to this, it can be as simple as just using your body weight, and just trying something like, sort of squats, lunges, push-ups, pull-ups, and you can use the wall, you can use chairs, just so you get your confidence up. It's all about sort of building on it, so it doesn't matter where your starting point is, but it does matter that you do it. And just finding some movement that brings you joy really makes a difference. So it could be, a dance class, it could be skipping, which is actually really hard and high cardio. So have a think of things that you've enjoyed in the past, and that you maybe miss. and then book yourself in for that class that you said you were going to do sort of a year ago. If we just action it whilst we're thinking about it, then it's done. So yeah, have a think about what brings you joy. So if we enjoy it, we're much, much more likely to stick to it and keep doing it. So sleep is another one. So I mentioned that a little bit earlier in the presentation, and it can increase risk of insulin resistance. So the duration of sleep as well is also linked to increased weight. And a mild sleep deficit of around 90 minutes for 6 weeks can increase fasting insulin from about 12%. So quite significant in 12 weeks. And if that kept happening, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, then you obviously are going to be insulin resistant by the end of that. So not ideal, not what we want. So if you are someone that struggles with sleep, starting by targeting your metabolic health to get that insulin back under control really, really helps. And also looking at your eating window, so not eating late at night can also really help with sleep. So environment is our fourth root. And for me, this is all about sort of stress management and finding ways to make what we want to happen. So how we respond to stress, we have a fight or flight response in the body, can massively impact our metabolic health. So our stress response is only designed to be very quick. So for example, in evolutionary terms, we would get a stress response through being chased by a lion, let's say. And then once that lion goes away, the threat's cleared, we then can go back to our normal states. But because we live in a world where we're constantly exposed to stressors, so we've got news articles, we've got our phones, we've got lots and lots of stimuli around us, and it is activating the stress response in the body. And our body doesn't know the difference between what's real, what's not real. It just has this fight or flight response. So it's just thinking about how we can reduce this going forward. So can we spend more time doing sort of meditation or doing journaling, which is really helpful, doing that mind dump exercise before bed to get all our thoughts out. Spending time in nature really reduces stress. Or even just having a think about what we can control and what we can't control. And just simply focusing on what we can look at, and it's just accepting what we can be really helpful. And then in terms of kind of how we can set our environment up for success, this is thinking about creating less friction for the things that we want to happen. So for example, if I wanted to go to an exercise class in the morning, I have two choices. I could either set my alarm and do everything in the morning in terms of finding my gym clothes, finding my trainers, getting my water bottle, and potentially be late for my gym class and potentially miss it. Or I could set everything up the night before. So I'm creating less friction to make that thing happen. So have a think about your environment, what it looks like. Do you have a bread bin? Do you have a biscuit tin? Do you have lots of snacks around your house where it's so easy to just pick them up and eat them? So have a think about how you can make your environment work for your goals better, because it does really, really make a difference. And then finally, mindset. So having a think about sort of what is our why? Why do we want this to happen? So a lot of people think it's to do with aesthetics when they first start thinking about their goals. So I want to lose X amount, or I want to fit into sort of X clothing. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, it's that you want more energy, or you want to be able to play with your grandchildren, or you just want to feel like yourself again and not be worrying about your health. So you just want to clear your mind. So have a think about what your why is and write it down. and just remind yourself of that going forward. So it really helps in terms of giving you that purpose and that drive. So we don't always want to rely on motivation. We do need to think about sort of those more internal factors and getting away from an all or nothing mindset. So it doesn't have to be, you're either absolutely perfect or you are going off the rails. This is really, really key because it's what we do consistently, which matters the most. And that's what really gets us the results that we want to see. So it's actually better to be just okay, but to do that consistently than to be in this all or nothing approach, because it essentially doesn't solve anything. So have a think about what your day looks like. What's the best that you can do today? Is it that you have to have food on the go? Okay, so what is the best option for that? So be realistic, make it work for you, and just try to make those smarter choices essentially day to day to help us long term. So just to summarize on our routes, nutrition, the key takeaway there is just to be mindful of your carbohydrate intake, and I will chuck in prioritize protein. I can't leave that one out. Movement, so go for a 10-minute walk after your meal. Sleep, use journaling to mind dump and clear your minds. Mindset, write down your why. And environment, surround yourself with people who want to improve your health. So think about your overall environment and what that looks like. So based on the information that we've covered, just have a think. Have a think about what could be your first step in fighting insulin resistance or reducing the likelihood that it's going to happen and improving your metabolic health. And ask yourself, how would you like to feel in 3 months' time? And what your life would look like if you didn't take action. So if you're already experiencing things like brain fog, things like aches and pains, you already have like high blood glucose, what could it be like in 3-6 months' time if you didn't take that action? So just ask yourself that question, how you actually want to feel. So I promised you that I would come back to this case study. And this person came looking at back pain and wanting a knee op. And instead of just being prescribed a painkiller, like most people would, to be honest, he got lucky. And the person that he saw was actually very much equipped about metabolic health and guided him through that process. And this was the outcome. So he actually lost a lot of weight, and he lost a lot of his symptoms that he was experiencing just by targeting insulin resistance. So no more acid reflux, no more high blood pressure, no more prediabetes, depression, IBS, back pain. He didn't need a knee op in the end. His knees were fine, and he was no longer tired all the time. So he said, I now feel the best I have in years, and I've got more energy, and I'm back into the jeans I wore 20 years ago. And medication free. So this is sort of what we want to see. So metabolic health, but not through taking medication, actually through targeting our bodily functions and our energy system and getting things back to the way they should be working. So just to go on then, before we go on to our Q&A, a bit about our programs and what we do here at Coombe Grove, because it can be that first step for many people. So our main metabolic health program is a 5-night stay. So we are based in the Bath countryside, so about 3 miles from city centre, if you don't know where we are. And you are supported when you are here with us. So you're guided in group workshops, you have 2 treatments, and you have your nutrition one-to-one consultation. So you go through all the 5 routes, you learn so much about metabolic health. We've got our resident GP, Dr. Campbell Murdoch, who does a presentation on it. You get all your meals provided for. So you're really sort of living and breathing how you can make this work long term. And then actually what we do is we invite you back in 3 months' time to do it all again on a shorter stay, so a 3-night stay. And we include a full health check again. So we'll look at your blood lipids, we'll look at your blood glucose, we'll look at your body composition, and your things like blood pressure, to just see where your metabolic health markers are at in comparison to your baseline when you first came to stay with us. So it's super, super powerful to have first that retreat and then that second retreat to check in, deep dive again into your challenges, what you've been experiencing, and get your metabolic health on track long term. So we do have a few different options as well. So if you're thinking, the 5 nights is maybe a little bit too long for you, we do have a 2-night program and our reset day as well. So our 2-night program still covers the 5 routes, but they're just not in as much detail. And you are still getting that health check, that important health check to look at what your key metabolic markers are saying. So then kind of where your metabolic health stands. You've got a really, really good indication. And then our reset day, that includes a body composition. It doesn't include bloods. We do blood pressure, but we will look at your waist circumference, your muscle mass, and your fat mass as, again, very key indicators. And we give you a sort of a snippet of each of the 5 routes and sort of really key tangible nutrition takeaways, including a cooking demonstration. So again, if you felt like the 2 nights was a bit too long for you, we also have those day events in our schedule. So you can secure your place for any of our retreats for £300. And then you pay the remaining balance about 4 weeks prior to stay. And because you've all spent your evening with me this evening, I was going to say this morning, you do have a £250 discount on our programs. So that's our 2-night and our 5-night stay. So that is within 48 hours of the webinar. So if you are interested, just give me an email. So my email is emma.patch@queengrove.com, and I will be more than happy to help and assist you. And then we are going to move on to our Q&A to finish. So we should have enough time to get through a few of your questions. So I think Katie is going to pop on and ask a few questions.
Hey Emma. So
Hello.
the first question is, what are the best HbA1c levels that we should target? So what should it be less than and how low is desirable? And also, how often should we go for blood tests to make sure we monitor it efficiently?
Yeah, really, really good question. So your HbA1c is an average of blood glucose over the last 3 months. So if you wanted to monitor it regularly, I would say maybe once a quarter, just to, as a rough figure, because then you've got that average of those 3 months. Whatever you've done in those 3 months in terms of the changes that you made, you should be seeing that in your result. And in terms of kind of what you would want it to be, essentially in the 30s. So anything late 30s, you're looking, closer to that pre-diabetes range, which is that 43, 44 mark in HbA1c. If you're looking, end 20s, middle 30s, low 30s, then you're in a good place. So I would say that's what you should aim for. I wouldn't really focus on it being too low. If it's not high, that's the key element, because genetics can play a bit of a factor in your HbA1c. So some people, it is just naturally a little bit higher. So I wouldn't focus on too low. I would just focus on it not being high. If you're interested in how to monitor it day to day, I highly recommend wearing a blood glucose monitor. So this is something that we provide on our retreats and our programs. It is an add-on, but I highly recommend doing that. And that's just to see your individual response to food. So you just put it on your arm and it lasts for about 2 weeks. And then you can see what's happening to your body with the food that you're eating. So it might be that you think, your blood glucose is absolutely fine and, you're not really having a response to certain foods. And then you wear the monitor and you realize actually that's not the case. And then you'll see things like, your food order. So if you have carbohydrates without any fat and protein and fiber, it will have quite a dramatic response in blood glucose. It'll have a lot bigger spike. Whereas if you combine it with that fat and protein, actually it's a lot more stable. So I highly recommend doing that just to kind of monitor and learn more about your body.
The next question is the dawn phenomenon something that I should be worried about? My blood glucose levels are always higher in the morning, even when they are low when I go to bed, and then they get lower during the day.
Okay, yeah, really good question. So, no, to answer your question, you shouldn't be worried about it. It's very, very common. So essentially, the dawn phenomenon is our cortisol, which is waking us up in the morning. So that's our hormone that makes us feel alert, and that's how literally our bodies wake up. So in response to high cortisol, you will have an increase in blood glucose because essentially it's getting our body ready for that fight or flight response. So it's just kind of getting you energized and alert before it starts to level out. So everyone gets this. So it is completely normal. And it's great that you find that they are quite low throughout the day and low before you go to bed. So it's not going to affect your source of sleep quality. Yeah, so I wouldn't worry about that at all. It's more about your average throughout the day. And yeah, keeping it as nice and stable and minimal spikes.
And the last question that we've got is the diet, including protein powders, helpful to supplement protein intake, or is it better to avoid due to how processed they are?
Yeah, good question. I would say if you are going to use protein powders, try to use ones which are more natural. So there's a brand, I think they're called the Organic Protein Powder Company. So very simple. But their ingredients are really, really good. So it's not, heavily processed, all these sweeteners, all these gums, all these additives. It's actually just natural ingredients. In an ideal world, you would be getting it from natural food because obviously then it's got extra vitamins, minerals, fats in it, and it's going to fill you up. Your body really recognizes that. But if that's not feasible for you, or if you're on sort of a vegan diet and you're struggling to get in enough protein, it can be a really useful additive to your overall diet. I would just be careful on, what brand you buy. That's the key one.
We've just had quite a few more questions pop up.
Okay.
So the next one is, are most people with PCOS insulin resistant?
Yeah, so in research is indicating that there is a very, very strong link between PCOS and insulin resistance. So it is advisable to, if you have PCOS, if you know someone with PCOS, to target reducing that hyperinsulinemia, so reducing that chronic high insulin. And the best way to do that is to do sort of a real food, slightly lower carbohydrate diet, essentially, where you're prioritizing protein and using natural fats. So I would say a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time it is related.
The next question is, this lady's already wearing a CGM, but she's wondering what she should see like throughout the day because she's getting small little bumps like throughout the day in her tracker,
Okay.
but she hasn't eaten throughout that time period, and she's wondering if that's okay.
If it's just small bumps, it might be that, for example, if you are moving around, your body's sort of using blood glucose, so it's gone up slightly, or if you're stressed. So if you're about to do, something at work and you feel quite stressed, it can increase. So it could be that your heart rate's gone up for some reason, so it could be exercise or stress, and then that's caused an increase in blood glucose. If it's just small little bumps, I wouldn't worry about it. It's never going to be completely flatlined, as long as it's not, going out of range. and very high spikes. Those are the key, and the drops, those are the key to minimize. So it sounds like, you're obviously monitoring it because you've got the blood glucose monitor and it's fairly stable from your question, which is really great.
And the next question is, how much carbohydrate should a patient with diabetes be aiming for during pregnancy to support a healthy pregnancy when dealing with insulin resistance?
Yeah, so with pregnancy, it won't differ that much because you're only supposed to have sort of an extra maybe 1 to 2 tablespoons, depending on what point of the pregnancy you're at. And you can still get adequate energy from sort of your protein and fats. And remember, we're not saying completely cut them out, we're just saying to reduce them. So you can start with that 100-gram mark of carbohydrates as a rough figure, because then, like I said, you can still include the vast majority of vegetables. You can include maybe some beans and pulses, small amounts of starchy carbohydrates. So you still are including some, but you're not doing, massive portions. So I would say it also depends on the pregnancy, what symptoms they're having. But it should be safe to go for that 100-gram mark as a rough figure.
The next question is, what should the sugar levels be throughout the day? I don't know if that's relating to how much sugar they can eat throughout the day or like what your blood sugar levels should be throughout the day.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of what your blood sugar levels should be, it does depend, like I said, on things like genetics. They can play a role. But essentially, I would advise anywhere between, if you're wearing a blood glucose monitor, anywhere between sort of 3.9 to 7 millimole, you would want it to be in that range. So nothing really above 7, ideally. And then in terms of kind of sugar, it's just being mindful of how much added sugar that we're including in our diet. So the less the better, just to be honest with you. To just try and use things like dark chocolate, 85% dark chocolate, still a little bit sweet, but it doesn't have anywhere near as much sugar as, milk chocolate or white chocolate. It doesn't have that moreish craving to keep on going back for more. So reduce as much as possible in terms of added sugar, and then that would be what I would advise for blood glucose levels.
The next question is intermittent fasting advisable to reduce blood sugar?
Yes, it can really reduce HbA1c. It's very effective for that because essentially your body is having that off time. So instead of you topping it up with food, your body just uses energy that it already has on its body. So your blood sugar does tend to reduce when you start doing things like intermittent fasting. And I would just start with 10 hours. It doesn't need to be extreme. I wouldn't advise to go extreme because it does increase cortisol in the body. So just start with around 10 hours. So like I was saying, that 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., or it could be, 8 to 6. So start with maybe around 10 and see how you get on.
The next one is, through diet, I have gone from diabetic to normal, but I know that I'm still insulin resistant. Having been pre-diabetic for 30 plus years, is there a chance that my insulin resistance can ever become normal again?
Yeah, good question. I mean, from the sounds of it, you've dramatically decreased your insulin resistant by getting your blood glucose range from diabetic to normal. So I would say massive well done for that. That's amazing. In terms of kind of can you ever become normal again? Well, now your blood glucose levels are in the normal range, you'll be less insulin resistant. So you might have some, and you can still target that. So sometimes it's just those small tweaks. So it might be increasing movement, it might be, increasing muscle mass, or it could be looking at your eating window just to help move that dial a little bit. So I would say it is possible to reduce it more, but it does depend on, things like your genetics, whether you can completely sort of reduce everything, I would say. But our programs really help with things like that. So, making you look at sort of everything, that holistic view, to really get those results that you want.
The next question is, are there any good snacks for us?
Yeah, so essentially with snacks, you would want to focus on including some protein sources. So it could be just as simple as like a bit of dairy, so a bit of yogurt or a bit of cheese, maybe a handful of nuts. That's really handy to have on the go. Um, Even just 2 squares of dark chocolate, like I was saying. But you will find when you get used to this way of eating, in terms of having more protein and having slightly more natural fats in your meal times, you are quite full. So you'll find your snack maybe not as much going forward, and you're just relying on your meals being more substantial. So I would say try to focus on changing your meals first, and then seeing if you actually need the snacks.
The next question is any spike bad, or is it if it only goes up more than 2 points?
So it is normal to have a little bit of a spike. So I know to answer your question. And then more than 2 points. So I'm guessing you mean sort of millimoles. So more than 2 millimoles is not that much. So say like it goes from 4 till 6, you will still be in range. But if your starting point is 7 to 9, then that's not ideal. So it depends on where your starting point is, to answer that question. So just looking at what is the range, is it in the 3.9 to 7?
The next question is, does it make sense to switch to brown bread and rice?
So it does have more fiber in it, which can help slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream, and is also beneficial for our gut bacteria. So if you are still eating high amounts of carbohydrate, yes, it does make sense to do that. However, I would say try to reduce the portion size. So that is the key element there. And combine it when you are having them with your protein and fats and vegetables, because that's what's really going to blunt the spike.
The next question is, what is your view on consuming alcohol if trying to manage insulin resistance?
Yeah, good question. So alcohol is an interesting one. It can have different impacts on different people. So some people it lowers blood glucose, some people it highes it. For me, it always has sort of a lasting impact in most individuals. So what I mean by that is it could affect their sleep quality, it could affect their sleep duration, and it could affect cravings the next day. So I would say it is not wise, if you're really struggling to manage your insulin resistance, it's not wise to consume alcohol regularly, just because it's of its lasting ongoing effects, which is not the most ideal, when we're trying to lower insulin.
I think we've got time for one more question, Emma.
Yeah.
Is there a reliable blood test for insulin resistance? My GP wasn't keen to test, saying that everyone is insulin resistant.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but that isn't the best response, is it? That's not exactly what you want to hear. Um, so to answer your question, if I don't think you'll be able to get tested fasting insulin through your GP. However, they absolutely can test your HbA1c, which is your average of blood glucose, and they absolutely can test your cholesterol. But when they test your cholesterol, look at your triglycerides and your HDL, and then you can divide the two to get your ratio, which is really key. So a lot of people will look at total cholesterol, but actually we want to look at the quality of your cholesterol, as that's a bigger indicator of metabolic health. So yeah, I would say that. So look at your HbA1c, look at your cholesterol, and you can also look at things like your waist circumference. So just get a tape measure, look at your waist circumference to see where that fits, to see if you are insulin resistant.
I think we'll wrap it up there, Emma.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Like I said, if you do want to get in touch, please do. We love hearing from you. And I hope you've all enjoyed this evening's webinar, and I hope we see you again at some point. Bye, everyone.